Could anyone have imagined that the main enemy in the vast expanses of the Wild West would not be a man with a gun, but an invisible icy wind? The first settlers who set foot on the Great Plains and Rocky Mountains encountered a force that could not be intimidated, bribed, or defeated in fair combat. The cold seeped through cracks, froze water in mugs right on the table, and turned every night into a test of endurance. The history of frontier settlement is not only about shootouts and gold rushes, but also about a quiet, persistent battle to keep warm within four walls. It was the ability to build a reliable shelter and keep the fire burning that determined whether a family would see the next spring or remain just a line in the mournful lists. Watch the video to the end to learn how ordinary soil became a better insulator than the most modern materials, and why the correct placement of a door could save the lives of an entire family. What if I told you that everything you believed about construction didn't work here, and that a mistake of a couple of meters cost lives? Choosing a location for the hut was the first and most important strategic decision that the head of the family made upon arrival at the site. It was not enough to simply build the house where there was a beautiful view of the valley or mountains. Pioneers quickly learned to read the landscape, looking for natural folds in the terrain or small depressions that could shelter the structure from the biting winds. A house built on an open hill would be blown through in minutes, making heating a completely useless endeavor. The orientation of the walls to the cardinal points was a real science, based on the bitter experience of their predecessors. A blank wall with no windows or doors was always turned towards the prevailing winds, most often to the north or northwest. This created a kind of shield that took the brunt of snowstorms and icy air currents. The entrance door was usually placed on the south or east side so that the morning sun would help melt the ice and snowdrifts. Even a slight deviation from this rule meant that after a blizzard, people would find themselves walled up in their own homes. The size of the hut was also dictated not by a desire for comfort, but by the harsh necessity of preserving precious heat. The ceilings were made deliberately low so that warm air would not accumulate where it was not needed, but would remain down below, near the inhabitants. The rooms were small, often limited to a single space where the whole family lived. The smaller the volume of air inside, the easier and faster it was to heat it with a single fireplace. Spacious halls and high ceilings remained a dream or something found only in wealthy homes on the East Coast. Here, cramped quarters were synonymous with survival. Surprisingly, even the shape of the roof was of paramount importance in the fight against cold and wind. A steep slope shed snow well, but created high wind resistance, which meant that the roof could simply be torn off by a strong gust. A roof that was too flat accumulated tons of snow, which served as excellent additional insulation, but threatened to collapse the beams under its weight. Builders had to find the perfect balance, calculating the angles of inclination literally by eye. Every log and every stone in the foundation was laid with the coming winter in mind. The foundation was often dug deep into the ground, or the floor was laid directly on compacted soil to take advantage of geothermal heat. The ground froze more slowly than the air, and the floor below ground level helped to maintain a positive temperature in the house. A high earthen embankment, called a zavalinka, was built around the base of the house, creating an additional buffer between the street and the floor. This prevented drafts that could cause cold feet and illness. In the absence of professional tools and materials, people performed miracles of engineering. They used moss, clay, and turf not just as fillers, but as a sophisticated thermoregulation system. Walls were made double, filling the space between them with earth or dry leaves to create a thermos effect. Each element of the structure performed a double or triple function, working toward the common goal of preserving life. Particular attention was paid to the entrance area, which was the main source of heat loss in any dwelling. Doors were made heavy, knocked together from several layers of boards lined with skins or a thick fabric. Often a small porch or vestibule was built to prevent cold air from entering the living area immediately when the door was open. This buffer compartment also served as a storage place for firewood and tools that needed to be kept dry. Inside the hut, the space was organized around the heat source, creating invisible but distinct temperature zones. Sleeping places were located in the warmest corners, away from the outer door and window openings. Water supplies and foodstuffs that were sensitive to frost were also stored in strictly designated areas where the heat from the hearth reached. Family life was confined to a small area of light and warmth, beyond which the deadly cold reigned. The very philosophy of frontier construction was radically different from the urban architecture of the time. There was no place for aesthetics' sake. Beauty lay in reliability and functionality. A house was not just a place to sleep, but a complex machine for survival, requiring constant maintenance and attention. Every crack that appeared in the wall was perceived as a hole in a ship and was repaired immediately. This chapter of architectural history was written not with ink on paper, but with an axe on wood and a shovel on the ground. The people who built these houses did not have degrees in architecture, but they had an intuitive understanding of the physics of heat. Their decisions were tested by practice, where the price of a mistake was death from hypothermia. Do you agree with this? Please tell us what you think about this. Every opinion is valuable. Are you ready to learn the truth that the warmest houses were not built of wood at all? On the vast plains, where trees were as rare as water, settlers turned to the only material available, the earth itself. Dugouts and sod houses, which were disparagingly called mole holes, turned out to be an ingenious solution to the problem of cold weather. Thick walls made of tightly packed layers of sod provided phenomenal insulation that thin plank structures could not match. In winter, such a house retained heat for days, and in summer, it remained refreshingly cool. Construction began with cutting bricks from the top layer of soil, densely intertwined with the roots of steppe grasses. These roots served as natural reinforcement, preventing the earth from crumbling and ensuring the strength of the structure. The layers were laid with the grass facing down, tying the rows together like brickwork to make the walls monolithic. The thickness of such walls could reach a meter, which turned the house into a real fortress, impregnable to wind and frost. Unlike log houses where gaps inevitably remained between the logs, requiring caulking, turf walls were completely airtight. The wind simply flowed around them, finding no way to penetrate inside. The windows in such houses were small and deeply recessed into the thickness of the wall, which created an additional air cushion. The windowsills were so wide that you could sleep on them or use them as tables. The roof of a turf house was the heaviest and most complex element of the entire structure. Poles were laid on a massive central beam, then a layer of branches or brushwood, and on top of that, the same layers of turf. The weight of such a roof was enormous, but it was this weight that ensured a tight fit and protection against heat loss. Snow that fell on such a roof did not melt from the internal heat, but created an additional layer of insulation. However, living in an earthen house had its own significant drawbacks that had to be put up with. Fine dust and earth constantly fell from the ceiling, covering everything with a thin layer of dirt. During prolonged rains, the roof became saturated with water and began to leak, turning the floor into a dirty mess. The humidity inside was always high, which required constant heating even on relatively warm days. Despite the dampness, it was the dugouts that saved thousands of lives during the harshest winters, when temperatures dropped to critical levels. Earth is inertial. It takes a long time to heat up, but it also gives off heat for a very long time, smoothing out sharp temperature changes outside. Even if the fire in the hearth went out in the morning, the temperature in a turf house did not drop below zero. This gave the inhabitants a chance to wake up alive rather than freeze to death in their sleep. The interior decoration of such houses often consisted of whitewashing the walls with lime or covering them with old newspapers. This was done not only for beauty, but also to at least slightly secure the crumbling earth and make the room brighter. A light surface better reflected the meager light from the hearth or oil lamp, creating the illusion of comfort. Fabric canopies stretched under the ceiling caught falling debris and protected the beds. Many settlers started out in dugouts carved into the hillside before building a house above ground. It was temporary housing, which often became permanent for many years due to the lack of wood. Entire generations grew up in such conditions, for whom the smell of damp earth was the smell of home. It was a life literally merging with the landscape, where the boundary between nature and housing was blurred. Turf houses required annual repairs and renovations as the walls gradually deteriorated under the influence of wind and water. The outside walls were overgrown with grass and flowers, and in spring such a house turned into a blooming hill. A traveler could drive a few meters past the dwelling and not notice it if it weren't for the smoke coming from the chimney. This camouflage was unintentional but useful in dangerous times. The history of turf houses is a hymn to the ingenuity of people who managed to create comfort literally from the dirt under their feet. They prove that expensive materials are not necessary for survival. It is enough to understand the properties of nature and know how to use them. But how did they heat these earthen fortresses when firewood was worth its weight in gold? In the next chapter, you will learn what they used to heat their stoves in places where not a single tree grew. What I am about to show you is prohibited in 12 countries as a violation of fire safety regulations. But back then, it was the only way to survive. The hearth in a frontier cabin was not just a place to cook food, it was an altar of life, the center of the universe for the family. Its construction was a sacred ritual, the quality of which determined the fate of all the inhabitants of the house. The stones for the hearth were selected with particular care, because the wrong stone could explode from the heat and injure people. In regions where there were no stones, durable clay mixed with grass and small pebbles was used to create monolithic structures. Such adobe fireplaces were dried slowly, first by lighting small fires to avoid cracks. Chimneys were often made of woven twigs, thickly coated with clay inside and out, which was a risky but necessary solution. If the clay fell off, the twigs could catch fire, so the condition of the chimney was monitored with maniacal attention. The size of the fireplace was critical. Too large and it would draw all the heat into the pipe. Too small and it would not be able to heat the room. Craftsmen tried to make the firebox shallow but wide in order to reflect as much infrared radiation as possible into the room. The back wall of the hearth was sometimes covered with a sheet of iron, if it could be found, to increase heat transfer. These were primitive but effective reflectors that increased the efficiency of the open fire. In later periods, cast iron potbelly stoves, which were brought with them or ordered from catalogs, became a real treasure. They were much more efficient than open fireplaces, as they heated the air with their entire surface and required less fuel. Cast iron stoves allowed for precise control of combustion by closing the air vent, which was important for saving firewood. Several dishes could be cooked simultaneously on its flat surface, and water could be boiled. Placing the stove or fireplace in the center of the room or against an interior wall was a strategically sound decision. This allowed the heat to spread evenly throughout the entire volume of the dwelling, without escaping immediately through the cold exterior walls. The chimney was often laid across the entire room at an angle before leading outside to utilize the heat of the flue gases. Every degree of heat obtained from burning fuel had to remain in the house. Tending the fire was a duty that could not be interrupted for a single minute throughout the winter. At night, the coals were carefully covered with ash, so that in the morning the flame could be quickly rekindled without using precious matches. Losing the fire in winter was considered a disaster, as it was incredibly difficult to rekindle it with frozen hands. Fire was perceived as a living being that needed to be fed and respected. The space in front of the hearth was the most desirable place in the house, where the family gathered on long winter evenings. Here they dried wet clothes and shoes, repaired tools, and read aloud from their only book. It was an area of maximum comfort, beyond which the temperature dropped sharply. The temperature difference in the room could be tens of degrees between the area near the fire and the far corner. Fireplaces also served an important ventilation function, drawing damp and musty air out of the crowded room. The draft created a constant flow of fresh air through the cracks, which prevented suffocation, but also cooled the house. It was necessary to constantly seek a balance between the need to breathe and the desire to stay warm. The dampers in the chimney were an essential tool for climate control. Ash from the hearth was never thrown away just like that. It was a valuable resource in the household. It was used to make soap, to tan hides, and even as insulation, covering the floor with it. Hot ashes or heated stones were wrapped in cloth and placed in beds to keep warm at night. The hearth provided not only heat and food, but also hygiene products and survival tools. Thus, the stove or fireplace was a complex engineering structure integrated into the daily life and structure of the home. It was the heart that pumped hot blood through the veins of the cold dwelling, sustaining life within it. Without a reliable hearth, even the thickest walls could not save you from the icy breath of the prairies. Don't forget to like this if you are impressed by the ingenuity of the first settlers. Want to know a secret that will change your perception of construction? The main battle for warmth was not fought during the construction of the log house, but when sealing the gaps between the logs. Wood is a living material. It dries out, warps, and changes shape, opening the way for the wind. The process of filling these gaps, called caulking, was an endless task that continued year after year. They used anything that could hold its shape and did not rot too quickly. Moss, wool, old rags, and even corn leaves. The most popular material for caulking was a mixture of clay, sand, and water, to which a binding component was added. Dry grass, straw, or bison wool collected from bushes was used as a binder. This solution, called daubing, was applied by hand or with wooden spatulas, tightly packed into the gaps. The quality of this work was tested on the first windy night. If the candle flame flickered, it meant that there was a gap somewhere. The outside of the house was often covered with boards or shingles if there was a sawmill nearby, creating a ventilated facade. This protected the clay plaster from being washed away by rain and created an additional air gap. The air trapped between the logs and the cladding acted as an excellent heat insulator. If there were no boards, the walls could simply be covered with hay or corn stalks for the winter. The interior walls of the hut were also insulated to create comfort and retain heat. They were covered with skins, blankets, or old carpets, creating a multi-layered barrier against the cold. The fabric on the walls not only insulated, but also absorbed sound, making the small room less echoey. Wealthy settlers could afford to cover the walls with several layers of newspaper using flour paste. Special attention was paid to the corners of the house, where the logs joined and where cold bridges most often occurred. The corners were coated especially carefully, sometimes with clay rounded inside the room. In some cases, the corners were covered with boards from the inside, filling the resulting cavity with sawdust or ash. A freezing corner was immediately covered with frost, signaling a problem that needed to be solved urgently. The floor in the house was another critical area through which precious heat escaped. If the floor was wooden, the gaps between the boards were plugged with ropes or filled with resin. Thick woven rugs made of rags, skins, or a layer of dry grass were laid on the floor and changed regularly. Cold floors were the main cause of illness, so people tried to keep their feet warm by any means possible. The ceiling, as the place where warm air rose, had to be as airtight as possible. A thick layer of earth, leaves, or sawdust was poured onto the ceiling boards. This cushion prevented heat from escaping through the roof, acting like modern mineral wool. The layer of insulation in the attic could reach half a meter, which put a huge load on the beams. In winter, the snow that fell around the house was not cleared away to the ground, but rather raked up against the walls. The snowdrifts acted as external insulation, protecting the lower crowns of the log house from direct contact with the frosty air. In fact, the house was in a snow cocoon, inside which its own temperature was maintained. In the spring, this snow had to be quickly removed so that the meltwater would not flood the house. Dealing with drafts was part of the daily routine, as inevitable as cooking. From an early age, children learned to find places where drafts were coming from and plug them with whatever means were at hand. The hut was a living organism that was constantly changing, breathing, and requiring care. Only complete airtightness could guarantee that fuel would not be wasted. Ingenuity and insulation knew no bounds and depended on local conditions and available resources. Some used old newspapers, some used a mixture of manure and straw, and some used moss from the north side of trees. The goal was the same: to create an impermeable shell that would separate fragile human life from the merciless elements. In the next chapter, you will learn how ordinary grass could become a roof over your head that could withstand tons of snow. The roof was the most complex and important element of any frontier cabin. It had to withstand not only its own weight, but also the enormous load of snow, which could be meters deep. In wooded areas, they used shingles, thin wooden plates that were cut by hand from straight-grain logs. Laying shingles required skill. Each subsequent row had to overlap the previous one so that water would run off without getting inside. However, in the plains where there were not enough trees, turf became the main roofing material. Such a roof was like a real layer cake. Branches were laid on the strong beams, then a layer of grass or hay, and finally layers of earth. The weight of such a structure was enormous, so very thick support posts were required, often placed right in the middle of the room. If the supports could not withstand the weight, the roof could collapse inward, burying the inhabitants beneath it. The main problem with turf roofs was their permeability during prolonged rains. Water soaked into the earth, found its way through the branches, and began to drip inside in dirty streams. Housewives were forced to keep basins and buckets at the ready, placing them throughout the house during rain. Sometimes a tarpaulin or oilcloth was stretched over the bed or table to create a dry island. Despite the leaks, the turf roof had unmatched thermal insulation properties. In summer, it did not heat up in the sun, keeping the house cool, and in winter, it retained heat better than any modern insulation. The grass on the roof continued to grow, and the roots of the plants further strengthened the soil, making the roof monolithic. Often, flowering sunflowers or even small bushes could be seen on the roofs. Snow on such a roof was not an enemy, but an ally, provided, of course, that the beams could support its weight. The layer of snow acted as an additional blanket, completely stopping heat loss through the top. People did not deliberately clear the snow unless there was a risk of collapse, allowing nature itself to insulate their homes. In severe frosts, the temperature under the snow on the roof could be tens of degrees higher than on the surface. For waterproofing, if possible, birch bark or pieces of leather were placed under the layer of turf. Birch bark, rich in tar, did not rot and drained water well, but it was impossible to obtain it in the steppe. Therefore, they had to rely on the thickness of the earth layer and hope that the clay in its composition would retain water. After each heavy rain, earth had to be added to the roof to cover the washed-out areas. Not only water and weight posed a danger, but also the inhabitants that lived in the straw or earthen roof. Mice, snakes, and insects often fell from the ceiling directly onto the dining table or into beds. This was an unpleasant but inevitable part of life in a house built from natural materials. The ceiling was often covered with light-colored fabric, muslin, to provide some protection from falling debris. In wealthier homes or where there was a railroad, roofing felt or even sheet iron could be used. An iron roof was the height of luxury. It did not leak, did not rot, and lasted for decades without repair. But in winter, the iron froze and became covered with condensation from the inside, requiring good insulation of the attic. The sound of rain on an iron roof was the music of civilization for people accustomed to the dull thud of raindrops on the ground. The roof design defined the silhouette of the entire house and spoke of the owner's wealth and skill. A high ridge and large overhangs protected the walls from slanting rain and diverted water away from the foundation. The flat roofs of dugouts were a necessary measure dictated by the shortage of long logs for rafters. The evolution of the roof from an earthen mound to a shingle-covered structure reflected the settler's path to stability. The roof was a symbol of protection, the very covering that separated the fragile world of the family from the endless sky and its whims. Building a reliable roof meant securing the future, giving children a chance to grow up warm and dry. It was the crowning achievement of every frontier builder, his greatest pride and his greatest concern. What if I told you that windows at that time were not made of glass at all? Glass on the frontier was a rare, expensive, and incredibly fragile commodity that was difficult to deliver intact over bumpy roads. In the first huts and dugouts, window openings were often covered with oiled paper or grease-soaked cloth. This material let in a dim, yellowish light, but was completely opaque, hiding the outside world. Oil-coated paper retained heat well and did not break from accidental impact, but it could easily be torn by wind or hail. Light was necessary for working inside the house, but each window was a huge hole in the thermal insulation of the walls. Therefore, windows were made small, often with only one frame, located on the sunny side. In winter, such windows quickly froze over, covered with a thick layer of ice that completely blocked the light. It was necessary to place a candle on the windowsill or scrape the ice with a knife to see anything outside. To protect against the cold, heavy wooden shutters were hung on the outside of the windows, which were closed at night and during storms. The shutters created an air gap between themselves and the frame, significantly reducing heat loss. Inside, the window openings were covered with thick blankets or skins, turning the room into a dark cave. The struggle for light always lost out to the struggle for warmth, and on the coldest days, the house was in semi-darkness. In the absence of glass and paper, they even used mica or cleanly tanned, thin skins and bladders of large fish and animals. These materials were opaque and let in little light, but they were durable and free. The use of such archaic materials threw the settlers' way of life back centuries to the Middle Ages. But on the frontier of civilization, old methods often proved more reliable than new technologies. When real glass was obtained, it was treasured as the greatest of treasures. Window frames were divided into many small squares, so that only a small piece of glass would need to be replaced in case of breakage. Transporting window frames was a special operation. They were packed in boxes with grain or sawdust. Broken glass was a tragedy, as replacements could only arrive after several months or even years. The gaps around the window frames were a constant source of drafts and required careful caulking. The frames were often made fixed so they could not be opened to minimize the number of gaps and joints. Ventilation was provided through the door or chimney, as opening a window in winter was an unacceptable luxury. In summer, such windows turned the house into a stuffy trap, but in winter, they saved lives. Windowsills served not only as shelves for small items, but also as indicators of the outside temperature. The thickness of the ice and how quickly the water melted determined how severe the frost was. The patterns on the glass were the only interior decoration created by nature itself. Children breathed on the glass to melt the frost and look at the endless, snowy desert. The windows were positioned to catch as much daylight as possible, saving candles and oil. South-facing windows provided light and a little warmth, while north-facing windows were avoided altogether. The window was a connection to the world, a way to see approaching danger or guests in advance. But it was also a vulnerable spot through which strangers' eyes could peer into the house. In wealthy homes, double frames appeared, creating the effect of double glazing, which was a revolution in heat conservation. The space between the frames was sometimes filled with moss or cotton wool for beauty and additional insulation. But for most pioneers, glass remained a dream, a symbol that life had improved and become civilized. A window in a hut was a compromise between the need to see and the need to keep warm. Every square centimeter of transparent surface was paid for with extra firewood in the stove. The history of windows on the frontier is a story of the transition from blind protection to openness to the world as man conquered nature. And in the next chapter, you will learn what burned in the settlers' stoves when there was not a single bush for 100 miles around.
Firewood is scarce. Here, every piece of wood is worth more than gold.
In the wooded east, or in the mountains, the fuel problem was easily solved. There were forests everywhere, and firewood was harvested by the mountain. But on the Great Plains, where the grass touched the sky and trees grew only in narrow strips along the rivers, fuel was more expensive than gold. Settlers were horrified to discover that they had nothing to feed the fires in their stoves. And then the prairie itself and its unusual resources came to the rescue. The most common and accessible fuel on the plains was buffalo chips, dried bison dung. Women and children walked across the steppe with sacks, collecting these patties, which burned with a hot, smoldering flame. They gave off good heat, but burned quickly and filled the house with a specific acrid smell. This fuel was literally underfoot, and its reserves seemed inexhaustible until the buffalo herds disappeared. When the dung ran out, or it was impossible to find it under the snow, they used cattails or twisted hay. Tight bundles of stiff prairie grass were twisted into tight knots, similar to logs. The grass burned instantly, flaring up like gunpowder, so it had to be added continuously. The person at the stove could not leave for a minute, working as a stoker to maintain at least some heat. Resourceful settlers even invented special hay presses to make dense briquettes that burned longer. However, harvesting such a large amount of hay required enormous labor in the summer, when it was necessary to harvest the crops. The mountains of hay near the house also posed a fire hazard that could destroy the entire farm. But there was no choice, either hard work or a cold death. Another surprising type of fuel was corn cobs left over after the harvest. The dry stalks burned hot and clean, giving off a pleasant smell and good charcoal. In good harvest years, corn could be burned along with the grain if prices fell so low that it was more profitable to burn it than to sell it. It was a bitter irony, burning food to keep from freezing. Along rivers and streams, people collected driftwood and snags washed ashore during floods. Every twig and every splinter was picked up and carefully stacked in a woodpile. In some areas, it was possible to find brown coal or peat deposits on the surface. This was a great stroke of luck, but such coal was often of poor quality, producing a lot of ash and sulfurous smoke. Fuel economy was paramount. The stove was only lit for cooking, trying to keep the heat as long as possible. In winter, the family went to bed early, immediately after sunset, so as not to waste firewood and candles. Life came to a standstill, obeying the rhythm of the fire and the availability of fuel in the woodpile. Searching for fuel was a dangerous occupation. One could get lost in a blizzard or encounter hostile tribes. Children sent out to gather dung often fell victim to sudden storms. The fuel supply for the winter was as important an indicator of preparedness as the flour supply. The lack of firewood also changed cooking habits. Dishes that required long simmering gave way to quick frying or boiling. Bread was baked once a week, melting in the oven to full power and eaten stale. Life was adapted to the capabilities of the hearth, not the other way around. Fuel shortages were a constant companion in the plains, forcing people to show remarkable ingenuity. The ability to see a source of heat in dry grass or manure was the key to survival. Fire obtained with such difficulty was valued more highly than anywhere else on Earth. Inside the hut in winter, a special microclimate formed, far from modern ideas of comfort. The air temperature was extremely uneven. It was hot near the ceiling, while water froze in a bucket on the floor. Drafts swept across the floor, forcing residents to wear shoes even inside the house. People lived in a constant temperature gradient, moving from heat to cold within the same room. Sleeping areas were set up on raised platforms to get away from the cold floor and closer to the warm air above. Beds were covered with numerous layers: straw mattresses, woolen blankets, buffalo skins, and patchwork quilts. Goose down duvets were incredibly valuable, as down was the best at retaining body heat. People often slept in their clothes and sometimes even wore hats to keep their heads warm. Before going to bed, the bed had to be warmed up. Special hot water bottles with coals, heated bricks, or irons wrapped in flannel were used. This ritual was mandatory, as going to bed in an icy bed meant losing precious calories. Children were put to bed together so that they could warm each other with their bodies. Often, the whole family slept in one large bed during the most severe frosts. Humidity in the house was another problem. People's breath, cooking, and drying clothes made the air damp. Condensation settled on cold walls and windows, turning into frost or ice. In the morning, this ice began to melt, creating dampness and mold in the corners. Ventilation through the chimney helped, but it drew out the heat, so the windows were rarely open. Clothing inside the house was not much different from outdoor clothing: woolen shirts, vests, warm shawls, and knitted socks. Layering was the main principle for keeping the body warm in a cold room. Women wore several petticoats. Men wore warm flannel underwear. It was not customary to undress completely, and it was cold, so hygiene procedures were carried out quickly and by the fire. Getting up in the morning was the hardest part of the day, when you had to climb out of your warm cocoon into a house that had cooled down overnight. The person on duty, usually the father of the family, got up first to light the stove and heat water for washing. The rest of the family stayed under the blankets until the air warmed up a little. This morning, cold-tempered character and taught discipline. Food in winter was fattier and more caloric to give the body energy for heating. Hot coffee, thick soups, and porridge were the staple diet during the cold months. Food cooled instantly, so they ate quickly, straight from the fire. The table was placed as close to the stove as possible to keep the food and people warm. Illnesses spread instantly in such a microclimate. If one person fell ill, everyone else did too. Pneumonia and bronchitis were frequent visitors to the frozen huts. People treated themselves with folk remedies, warmed their chests with hot compresses, and drank herbal infusions. Warmth was the main medicine, and the sick were given the warmest place by the fire. Household chores were done during daylight hours and closer to the source of heat. Women sewed, knitted, and cooked while sitting by the hearth, while men repaired harnesses or tools in the same place. Life was confined to the radius of heat from the stove, with the rest of the house used only for storage. The microclimate of the hut was a severe test for the body, but people adapted. They learned to appreciate every breath of warmth and to create comfort despite the icy wind outside the walls. This ability to find comfort in discomfort was a trait of a true pioneer. Preserving food in winter was as important as staying warm, because hunger killed faster than the cold. Paradoxically, food did not need to be cooled, but protected from freezing. Potatoes, carrots, onions, and pickles turned into ice cubes and spoiled if simply left in the house. A root cellar, dug deep into the ground, was used for storage. The cellar was located either under the floor of the hut, with a hatch in one of the rooms, or as a separate structure outside. The temperature underground remained stable, just above freezing, which was ideal for vegetables. The entrance to the outdoor cellar was sloped and closed with double doors, which were covered with snow or straw. It was a natural refrigerator with the opposite effect. It heated rather than cooled. Meat, on the other hand, was stored in the cold, hanging carcasses in barns or on the north side of the house. Frozen meat could be stored for months without losing its properties. Pieces were simply sawed or chopped off the carcass with an axe as needed. This was convenient, but required protection from predators. Wolves and coyotes that could steal the supplies. Flour, grains, and sugar were stored in dry places, in tightly closed barrels or tin cans. The main enemy here was mice, which migrated en masse to human dwellings in winter. A cat in the house was not a pet, but an essential tool for food security. Losing a bag of flour to rodents could mean a hungry spring for the whole family. Preservation was the main method of storing vegetables and fruits for the winter. Jars of pickles, jams, and compotes were the housewife's golden reserve. They were stored on shelves, wrapped in old blankets or newspapers, so that they would not burst from the cold if the temperature in the house dropped. The sound of a jar bursting in the night was the sound of the loss of part of one's labor and food. Eggs were rare in winter, as chickens stopped laying due to the cold and lack of light. To preserve summer eggs, they were coated with fat or stored in lime, in boxes with sawdust. Milk froze in winter and was stored in ice circles, with pieces broken off for cooking. Butter was churned for future use and salted, stored in stone pots in a cool place. Water was a separate concern. Buckets of water were brought into the house at night and placed near the stove, but even there it was covered with ice. Snow was melted for household needs, but water from a well or river was preferred for drinking and cooking. The hole in the river had to be renewed every morning, breaking through the thick ice with an ice pick. Dried fruit and meat, jerky, were a strategic reserve that was not affected by cold or heat. They were stored in cloth bags hung from the ceiling beams, where it was drier and warmer. Such products were light, nutritious, and did not take up much space. Inventories were checked regularly. The housewife knew exactly how many potatoes or cups of flour could be used per day to last until spring. Saving food was an art that required strict discipline from all family members. An extra piece of bread today could mean hunger tomorrow. The storage system was a complex logistical task that required knowledge of physics and biology. The cellar was a safe where the family's life was stored in the form of calories. The ability to preserve the harvest was no less important than the ability to grow it. Winter on the frontier tested not only people's bodies, but also their minds. The term cabin fever was born here, describing the state of claustrophobia and irritability from being locked up for a long time. Blizzards could cut off a farm from the outside world for weeks and months. Families found themselves locked in a confined space, seeing the same faces and hearing the same conversations. The silence of the snowy plain was deafening and weighed on the psyche more heavily than any noise. The howling of the wind in the chimney became the only voice from the outside world, often frightening and melancholic. People began to hear voices, footsteps, or crying in it, teetering on the brink of insanity. Maintaining mental health required effort and conscious work on oneself. Routine and a strict daily schedule were the main cure for melancholy and apathy. The strict performance of duties, even the simplest ones, structured time and gave a sense of control over the situation. Lessons for children, reading the Bible, needlework. All this filled the day with meaning. Idleness was a dangerous enemy, opening the door to depression. Music was a salvation. A violin or harmonica could change the mood in the house in a minute. Songs dancing on the patch of floor by the stove, and storytelling helped relieve tension. Families who knew how to joke and laugh endured isolation much more easily. Letters and diaries became an outlet, a way to talk to someone outside the hut. People described their lives, their fears and hopes, even though they knew it would be a long time before their letters were sent. Diaries from that time are full not so much of descriptions of events as of reflections and prayers. Conflicts in a confined space flared up instantly, and the ability to quell them was a vital skill. People learned patience, forgiveness, and the art of overlooking each other's minor flaws. There was no personal space, and respect for another person's inner peace replaced physical walls. Sometimes, to take their minds off things, the men would go hunting or simply check the distant boundaries of the plot, risking their lives. It was a way to be alone, to feel the space, and to return refreshed to the warmth. Women were often deprived of this opportunity, remaining guardians of the hearth. The anticipation of spring became an obsession, and every sign of warming was perceived as a celebration. The first rain and the first thaw became events of enormous significance. The calendar on the wall, where the days were crossed off, was the most important document. Faith helped many not to give up during the darkest and coldest nights. Prayer was a dialogue with a higher power, giving hope that the trials were not in vain. The awareness of their mission to build a new life gave them strength. The psychological strength of the walls was more important than the physical ones. If the spirit broke, the body gave up. Those who survived this isolation came out of it as different people, hardened, silent, and knowing the value of words and warmth. It was a school of life, with the arrival of spring as the final exam. The story of how huts became fortresses against the cold is not just a tale of the building technologies of the past. It is a saga of human perseverance, of the ability to create a home where nature resists it. Every log, every piece of turf, every coal in the hearth was imbued with the will to live and faith in tomorrow. The settlers did not conquer nature. They learned to live with it in a complex and dangerous symbiosis, using its own forces for protection. Their experience reminds us that true comfort is created not by gadgets, but by the warmth of human hands and hearts. What did you find most surprising or difficult about the early settlers' way of life? Could you survive a winter in a sod house heated with dry grass? Share your thoughts in the comments, suggest topics for future videos, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories about the people who built America.